On today's show, we'll be joined by weekly co-host Ben DuBose to discuss the Houston Rockets' competitive game against the LA Clippers despite no Jalen Green, Kevin Porter Jr., or Jae'Sean Tate. How did they make things look so competitive? Why did this Houston Rockets team look so different without those players out there in the lineup? KJ Martin continuing to prove and showcase why he should absolutely be a starter at this point in his NBA career. Jabari Smith Jr. playing with confidence, unlocking more of his game and showcasing some of his skills. We're going to break down all of it coming up right here at Locked On Rockets.
This is Mission Control, Houston.
Ignition sequence start.
The Houston Rockets select Jalen Green and Jabari Smith Jr.
T-minus 15 seconds. Guidance is internal.
Every time I step on that floor, I'm coming.
You're getting somebody who's going to come in with a chip on their shoulder, somebody who's going to come in and compete from day one.
6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
What's up and welcome to another edition of Locked On Rockets, your daily podcast home for everything Houston Rockets basketball. As always, I'm your host, Jackson Gatlin, native Houstonian and credentialed media member. I'm also the host of Locked On NBA Mondays. Be sure to follow along on Twitter at JT Gatlin. The show, of course, at Locked On Rockets, free and available wherever you get your podcasts, including YouTube, where you can help us out tremendously by commenting anything below. Tell me your thoughts on this Rockets-Clippers game and the way that the Houston Rockets played in this game without Kevin Porter Jr. and Jalen Green. As always, appreciate you for making LOR part of your day, whether it's on the way to work or at the gym or on your lunch break in the evenings. Do sincerely appreciate you for making LOR part of your day. Today's episode is brought to you by Prize Picks. First-time users can receive a 100% instant deposit match up to $100 with promo code LOCKEDON. That's prizepicks.com, promo code LOCKEDON. And joining us now is your weekly co-host, the podfather himself, Rockets Wire editor and host of the Logger Line podcast, Ben DuBose. You can follow on Twitter at Ben DuBose. And Ben, things are heating up in the Rockets, race to the bottom, I guess. They are cementing their position at the bottom of the standings. Now losers of 10 games in a row. They've only won one out of their last 16 games, so 15, a lot of losing going on. But this game against the Clippers, right? No Kevin Porter Jr. out still with injury. No Jalen Green or Jae'Sean Tate, who were serving their one-game suspensions for the little dust-up that took place Friday night against the Sacramento Kings. And we saw what felt like a completely different version of this basketball team than anything that we've seen all season long. And unfortunately, they still had a fourth quarter collapse, so at least they stayed on brand to an extent. But there was ball movement, there was energy. It felt like guys were playing unselfishly. This really felt like a different basketball team for about 3.5 quarters.
Yeah, I totally reject the arguments that the games Friday and today are basically more of the same simply because of the final score. And I know there are some that are sympathetic to Jalen Green or Kevin Porter Jr. that will point out that line that, hey, why are we talking about this in their absence when the Rockets are getting blown out? Honestly, today, there was a lot to like in regards to the energy of that team, how they played together, how the ball moved. I think, honestly, what happened today, they ran out of talent. I think, most of the starters, the lone exception was Jabari Smith, who had a poor shooting game. They all had plus minuses in the single digits. Whereas the guys that really struggled in this game, Daisha Nix, Josh Christopher, quite frankly, they shouldn't be playing. It's just Steven Silas didn't have a choice when the rotation is this short with no KPJ, no Jalen, no Jae'Sean Tate. You got burned simply because the Rockets ran out of rotation caliber players, and especially that period early in the fourth quarter, which is where you're going to have largely bench guys out there because you're trying to save those starters for the closing stretch, come back in, 6, 7, 8 minutes left in the fourth quarter, and the Rockets just couldn't hold on long enough to give them a chance in winning time. But look, I like the way that group played today. KJ Martin just dunk after dunk, got out, played with pace. I talked early in the game about how he and Alperen Sengun seem to play so well together because when the offense works through Sengun, the pace is faster and it rewards off-ball movement. Those are the two things that KJ Martin does disproportionately well. And I went and looked it up. NBA tracking data for two-man lineups of the Rockets' 25 most frequently used combinations this season. Only one has a positive net rating. It's Alperen Sengun and KJ Martin. So I think working those two together makes a lot of sense. Be it starting off the bench, whatever the configuration, it really makes sense when you think about it, simply because so much of KJ's game is dependent on playing with pace, which Alperen Sengun does, and rewarding basically movement off the ball, which Sengun does, and having that extra passer beyond whoever you put in at the guard spots. So there's a lot of ways you can go, but I think, there's a lot of synergies from playing those guys together, and the Rockets reaped the benefits of that today. Eric Gordon tied his season high, I believe, in points. It was one of his best games. I mentioned that Rafael Stone should email footage of this game to every front office in the NBA as the trade deadline approaches. I think there was a lot to like about this game. The Rockets just simply ran out of rotation caliber players, and that was the story when this game got away from them. But yeah, in the macro, I do think that when you look at how these guys function together, specifically the four outside of Daishen Nix in the starting lineup, Sengun, KJ, Eric Gordon, and Jabari Smith Jr. I thought Jabari's actually had a very good defensive game. Just offensively, he struggled to shoot again. Well, I shouldn't say again, because he did have his career high on 55% shooting on Friday night. So hopefully that's something to build on the offensive end. But I think that what it shows you is maybe there is something with this group. They're at, back to full health or close to it. Maybe there's ways that you can better optimize these guys together based on the groupings that go in at a various point. Because again, I liked a lot of what happened today. I just think the Rockets ultimately lost out of talent when certain rotation guys were in there that quite frankly shouldn't have been in the rotation, but Steven Silas just didn't have a choice.
Looking at this game, especially, first off, I do think KJ Martin had a fantastic outing yet again. When he's given the chance, when he is a starter, he produces. And when he plays alongside Alperen Sengun, those two have an insane chemistry with one another. They feed off of one another. It looks really good. And, we've been banging this drum all season, but the fact that KJ Martin isn't starting games yet and Eric Gordon is still starting ahead of him is kind of just a travesty at this point. KJ Martin is your Locked On Rockets player of the game from this one. He had a fantastic outing, 22 points on 9 of 14 shooting, was 1 of 3 from long distance, 3 of 4 at the charity stripe, had 9 boards, 2 assists in his 33 minutes of run. And yeah, but I think that, it's just, I feel like a broken record saying it some of the times we talk about, running through Sengun and KJ needs to start, but it's just, these are things that we see, right? And it's things that we see happen in a game like this where by default, KJ is going to be a starter, and then KJ goes out there and makes things happen. He makes things happen, whether it's coming off the bench. He makes things happen, whether it's as a starter. And he understands and knows his role and plays it so well and just adds kind of another dimension to this Rockets team because he is arguably, maybe not, it's not even worth an argument. He is the best cutter on this Rockets team. I was going to say maybe Jae'Sean Tate could have, some say in that argument, but I think KJ Martin is the best cutter, utilizes his athleticism well, can play in transition, and he feeds off of other guys so easily because he runs so well, and you can find him on the break, or he cuts and you can hit him with a quick little bounce pass or pass over the top, and he's right there at the bucket for an easy slam. KJ just makes things happen for this team.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's especially the case when the ball isn't sticking. There's less isolation play. And it was noteworthy today that Jalen wasn't out there and the ball moved the way that it did. I was thinking to myself during the game, to an extent, I feel sorry for Kevin Porter Jr. because I feel like a lot of the blame that gets thrown on KPJ, not saying it's undeserved, but some of it is out of convenience because Jalen is guilty of many of the same things. It's just more inconvenient to say those things about Jalen because of how much the organization has invested in him. And when we talk about how those two should be utilized, yes, that is a factor. Like you give Jalen a longer leash simply because of the investment and what you think his long-term ceiling is, which I think most people agree is more than Kevin Porter Jr. But honestly, this season, KPJ's defensive issues, we talked about that. Jalen's been worse. We talked about some of the efficiency issues on offense and the ball stopping. Honestly, Jalen, at least for the last 6 weeks, has been worse. And yet we talk largely about KPJ simply because, again, if you're going to do something about it, it makes more sense to sort of tweak KPJ's role than it does with Jalen. With Jalen, we all sort of agree that you just got to grin and bear because these are growing pains that are necessary for his long-term development. But I just thought today sort of reinforced this idea that the backcourt is an issue. It's amazing how much more fun they looked. I commented on that in the first half. And, some of it did correct in the second half once the game slowed down and the Clippers started taking it more seriously. It was a noon local time start. Once the Clippers really sort of ratcheted down and prevented the transition runouts, and it got sticky in the half court a bit more. But honestly, even then, when the Rockets had the right guys on the court, the ball still moved a lot more than it typically does. And it sort of feeds into the idea, I think, that you can survive with one of those two guys out there. I think certainly having either KPJ or Jalen in place of Daishen Nix would have clearly been a positive today. In the 35 minutes, somehow Daishen Nix led the team in minutes because, of course, he did. But
you know what? I don't want to talk about Daishen Nix. I just don't understand it. I don't know what's going on, and it's a lot of Daishen Nix.
Yeah, Zach Lowe on the money. But yeah,
on the money.
To get to the point, it is difficult when those guys are two of your five, given some of their habits. And maybe there are ways that you can better optimize your team, putting them in different roles and experimenting. And again, I sort of understand why the focus is on KPJ, because if you're going to, experiment with one and use them in different ways, it probably shouldn't be your number 2 overall draft pick from 2021. You're going to give deference to him and his role and keep it as constant as you can. So I sort of get with Jalen, you've got to just grin and bear it and deal with it. But I do sort of have some sympathy for KPJ watching this game today, because it made me, just sort of open my eyes and say, you know what, a lot of these issues apply to Jalen as well. It's just inconvenient for us to talk about them.
I want to piggyback off of that point, as well as touch base on some of the other aspects of this game, the fourth quarter unraveling that we saw again, some of the decisions with the lineups, right? Starting Daishen Nix, the lack of substitutions there, or the curious pattern of substitutions in the second half of this game by Stephen Silas, as well as digging a little bit deeper into Jabari Smith Jr.'s offensive night in this one, because I saw some really encouraging signs out of what he did offensively in this game, despite the 5 of 15 shooting. We're going to get there, but first, today's episode is brought to you by Prize Picks. Next game, how about Jalen Green to score more than 24.5 points? He'll have all that rest from his suspension game, so should be ready to go against the LA Lakers. What about Alperen Sengun to have more than 7.5 rebounds? He's been beasting on the boards as of late. And then maybe Jabari Smith Jr. to have less than 3.5 three-pointers made, because he's just been in that shooting funk for a little while now. So what is Prize Picks? It's daily fantasy sports, but how does it work? You pick 2 to 6 players, and if they score more or less than their Prize Picks projection, you can win up to 25 times back on your money on any entry that you submit. There's no competing against other people. It's just you versus the projections available. Prize Picks offers projections on any sport that you watch. That's NBA, NFL, MLB, NHL, PGA, you name it, they've got you covered over at Prize Picks. Entries can be made in 60 seconds or less. It's that simple. Download the Prize Picks app or go to prizepicks.com to sign up to play daily fantasy sports. First-time users can receive a 100% instant deposit match up to $100 with promo code LOCKEDON. If you deposit $100, Prize Picks will give you $100. If you deposit $50, Prize Picks will give you $50. Don't forget to enter promo code LOCKEDON at sign up for an instant deposit match up to $100. And continuing on here at Locked On Rockets, your daily podcast, home for everything Houston Rockets basketball. Talking about the Rockets' 121-100 loss in LA to the Clippers. And first night of a back-to-back, they'll be playing the LA Lakers a Monday evening, a very late tip-off CST, 9:30 CST for us here in the Central Time Zone. But Ben, to kind of piggyback off your point about the stickiness of the basketball, right? When you have Jalen and KPJ out there, I think you do need a guy on the court who can take matters into his own hands, right? The way that Eric did. Eric did it in moments in this game, right? Where Eric had moments where he was just, all right, offense is kind of sputtering, whatever. I'm just going to take the ball and I'm going to drive it. I'm going to take the ball. I'm going to make something happen. Even Josh Christopher had a few moments like that in this game. You need those dynamic creators, those scorers who can just put their head down and make something happen with the basketball. The problem is, when you have 3 of those archetypes of players all sharing the court at the exact same time, with Jalen, Kevin, and Eric all starting with one another, the ball just does not move. Because ultimately what happens is you'll have the my turn, your turn back and forth with Jalen and KPJ, and then eventually somebody just settles into, a drive or an ISO or whatever it is. Whereas in this iteration of the lineup, where Eric is effectively your one guy on the court who is that, like, I'm just going to take the ball and make something happen with it, there's a bit more willingness to share the ball amongst all 5 guys on the court. So I think we saw that. And then on top of that, the other point on Eric from this game that I wanted to make is just, I think this says a lot about the role that Eric has resigned himself to or accepted with this team. Absolutely. Eric could probably play this well every single night if he really wanted to. 24 points, 8 of 16 shooting, was 1 of 5 from beyond the arc, but was 7 of 8 at the free throw line, had a few rebounds, had a couple assists, only 1 turnover, 30 minutes of production. Eric can give any team this level of production on a consistent basis, but he has just kind of, I don't know, melted into the shadows a little bit, and he just plays his, whatever this 3-and-D role is, playing behind Jalen and Kevin, because that's what the organization wants. So I think it's just an important reminder to everybody that Eric Gordon can still hoop and is probably still the best basketball player on this Rockets team when he wants to be.
Yeah, and I think it speaks to, this idea that he's a bit disengaged because of the role. And hopefully other NBA teams will see this, and maybe, that will build some interest in him leading up to the trade deadline. I also think what Karthik Prasad, Stanford KP on Twitter, said on Friday night about Jabari feeling a bit more freedom when both of those lead guards, Kevin Porter Jr. and Jalen Green, aren't on the court at a given time. He's been more assertive on offense. And I agree with you that there were some clear positives from him today as well. He couldn't buy a shot for large stretches of this game, but I like what we're seeing from him. I like how he's getting more shifty on the drives. I like how he's getting more confident. And I think his shot over time, that's going to be fine. There's enough of a sample that I'm not worried that Jabari Smith Jr. forgot how to shoot baskets. He's getting there. You can see the progression from game to game. And some of his better offensive games are simply because he feels he has the freedom to create more. And Eric Gordon, I think you could see that today. Not saying he's the same archetype as Jabari Smith. Clearly he's not. But I think it's the same underlying dynamic. There's more freedom. When you have that regular starting five of KPJ, Jalen, Jabari, EG, and Sengun, there's just a bit too many cooks in the kitchen. And then once you get to the backups, it's sort of the reverse we've seen a lot of this year, in which there's not enough cooks in the kitchen. And you end up with Daishen Nix having to dribble too much. And with Garuba and Tari Eason, there's just not enough floor spacing.
Wait, we need a further cooking analogy here, because you've got way too many cooks in the kitchen in the starting lineup, and it's like the secondary lineup is like it's the cleanup crew, it's the bus boys, it's the custodians, like, because that's what they do, is that lineup cleans stuff up, right? They cause havoc, they make them whatever, they're cleaning up the mess, but they don't have any of the cooks to actually make something happen.
Yeah, and that's why I contend, like, you've got to actually watch the games. I've seen some criticism on Twitter just pointing out the box score and saying, well, you guys that are criticizing, some combination of Jalen and KPJ, well, now you've seen these games without him, and, it's no better. If anything, it's worse. That's not actually what's happening. What's happening is that the Rockets get to a point where the game gets away from them, largely because they just don't have enough depth of rotation caliber players. And especially when you combine it with a team that's playing for playoff positioning, like the Kings or the Clippers, in the second half, really, really dialing it in and preventing the transition play, they can get ugly in a hurry. But if you actually watch the games and how these progress, there are absolutely clear positives within the right groupings. And it makes you wonder if they should be, trying to experiment more than they have. We've talked about this before, but my biggest criticism of the Rockets this season, regardless of who you want to blame it on, Stephen Silas, Rafael Stone, whoever you want to point the finger at, the biggest criticism I have is that they have not experimented enough. You're seeing the same groupings, the same rotations time and time again. The only exceptions are when something like the suspensions today or the Kevin Porter Jr. injury forces them outside of the box. And there are some positives. It's just it doesn't show in the final score, because when those injuries or suspensions happen, they just don't have enough depth of rotation caliber players. And that's what, some of the nuance gets lost. When we criticize a guy like KPJ or Jalen or whoever it may be, I don't think anybody's really saying these guys should not be on the court, period, that they're not rotation caliber players. No, they absolutely are. What we get frustrated with is some of the patterns they're used in. And we wonder, would things potentially be better off if you sort of tweaked one guy's usage and the groupings that he was with, and so on and so forth. And today, I think it unlocked better versions, really the last two games, of guys like Eric Gordon and Jabari Smith Jr. And some of that may be circumstantial. Again, there's more shots to go around, period. But I do think it's at least worth experimenting a little bit and just trying to figure out, hey, is there a way that we can keep the good of KPJ and Jalen, to perhaps dial down some of the bad and play up some of the good in your surrounding parts as well.
And talking about making guys better, obviously KJ Martin just feasting off of this type of environment, the ball sharing, the ball movement, all of that. There was that insane sequence to end the half with KJ just taking the ball full length of the court, gets the poster slam on Terrence Mann, and then Terrence Mann turns around and drains a half court heave just before the final buzzer of the half. That was an insane moment.
The best way that I would sum it up when it comes to, the KJ Martin, Eric Gordon dynamic, we heard early on in the season, like, their rationale for trying Sengun off the bench was this idea that he fits better in that grouping because you can give him more touches with the ball in his hands. And we know he's absolutely dynamic with the ball in his hands, one of the better playmakers in the entire league. Whereas when he doesn't have the ball, it's much more of a work in progress. Now with Sengun, the counter to that is, look, he's just year 2, 20 years old, doesn't need just the most minutes period to try and develop. Yeah, that's a fair counter. But in terms of the logic that they presented of trying to maximize his touches and his role by allowing him to do more things with the ball in his hands, doesn't the same exact logic potentially apply to Eric Gordon, who could clearly get more touches, more freedom to actually create if he's the sixth man off the bench, as opposed to clearly a third wheel as your starting small forward, especially when you have a clear alternative in KJ Martin? That's just one of those weird things. The logic that was presented with Sengun, regardless of whether you agree with it, they put it out there. I don't see how the same thing doesn't apply to Eric Gordon, and yet they haven't even really tried it to this point.
Coming up, do you want to talk about the depth of talent that Ben has mentioned a couple different times here, and how the game kind of fell apart here in the fourth quarter against the LA Clippers? Plus, we'll touch base on Jabari Smith Jr.'s evening, some of the other positives from what he showcased in this game. Going to get there, but first, today's episode is brought to you by Built Bar. Are you looking for a delicious treat, but you don't want all the fat and calories that usually come along with it? Then you've got to check out Built Bar. Look, it's, you're still trying to stick to the New Year's resolutions, all that. I get it, right? You can do that with Built Bar, because with Built Bar, healthy is actually tasty. Seriously, they are so delicious, you won't even think that they're good for you. Perfect for your New Year's resolutions. What makes Built Bar so good? Well, for starters, they're covered in 100% real chocolate. That's right, real chocolate. And they come in unbelievable flavors like churro, peanut butter brownie, coconut almond, cookies and cream, salted caramel, raspberry, strawberry. The list goes on and on. My personal favorite is coconut brownie chunk. But you really can't go wrong with a single bar on their menu. Every single bar is low cal, low sugar, high protein, high fiber. Amazing if you're on a keto diet. Amazing if you're trying to cut back a little bit, lose a little bit of weight. Again, stick to those New Year's resolutions. You can check them out. Just go to built.com and use promo code LOCKEDON15 to get 15% off your very next order of the best tasting protein bars on the market. Again, that's promo code LOCKEDON15 for 15% off at built.com. And final segment here at Locked On Rockets, your daily podcast home for everything Houston Rockets basketball. Now, looking very quickly just at the Clippers side of things, I mean, they had two guys who were doing the majority of the damage. Terrence Mann, 31 points on 12 of 16 shooting, and then Kawhi Leonard, 30 points on 12 of 14 shooting. The Rockets really struggling to slow both of those guys down on the other side of the court. But, Ben, when we go to that fourth quarter, because you said, kind of the depth of talent a few times through these first couple segments, and I do think it's really curious how there in the fourth quarter, we saw this. It was like a very deliberate, just decision by Steven Silas and the coaching staff, right? They did not put Alperen Sengun and KJ Martin back in the game until the 6-minute mark. And I don't know why, but it feels like with the rotations, with the substitution,
back, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, maybe there's an argument to be had there, but even then, you're going to have Jalen and Jae'Sean Tate who are going to be fresh tomorrow, so maybe you lean on them more tomorrow night. But my argument is just, I do not understand why it feels that they are so rigid in their substitution patterns, because here's the issue is it was a game at the top of the fourth quarter, right? It was cool. Rockets are very much in it, all that.
They tied it briefly.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you could very easily start Sengun for the first part of that quarter, right? Give him a quick little 4 or 5 minute burst at the top of the quarter, then sit him and rest him, and then have him come in to close out the game and keep things competitive, right? Keep the well-oiled machine humming by doing that. And he does it with Eric Gordon, right? So EG will play the first 6 minutes of the first quarter, first 6 minutes of the third quarter, and then sit and then start at the top of the second and top of the fourth quarter. To your point earlier about Eric Gordon and his role and how it would look different if he was the sixth man coming off the bench, he gets those reps in the second unit, much to the chagrin of Rockets fans everywhere, with the non-staggering of Jalen and Kevin and all this. But Eric Gordon effectively runs that second unit. But I just don't know why we don't see a little bit more creativity with the substitution patterns, where it feels like Silas is so dialed in on a player having to play a 7 to 8 minute stretch, and that's it. And so much so to the point where we've seen stretches where starters aren't even getting subbed back into the game until sub 6 minutes left in the game, because he's waited too long, and then there's not a dead ball, there's no timeout, and we see minutes go by of actual in-game time where you're missing some of your best players on the court, and that leads to some of these collapses where the Rockets just didn't have the talent on the floor in that fourth quarter. They couldn't get anything going offensively, and by the time they put Sengun and KJ Martin back in the game, it was too late.
Yeah, and think it's really important to underscore the fact that this is not a new problem. And the Rockets, we've been talking about this for a week or so, have had games get away from them in this exact point, late in the third, early in the fourth quarter. It's the same song and dance. So, yeah, it is an opportunity to sort of experiment, try something that you haven't done before, because this problem should have been foreseeable. It's been occurring over and over again. And yeah, it sort of ties into the same theme, which is why isn't this team experimenting more than it is? They are so rigid with regards to the usage patterns of these guys. And it's not really working anyway. They've lost 10 straight games and 15 of 16 or whatever it is now. So again, it's just very odd. We're over halfway into the season and you're not seeing them really get the data they need by using these guys in different ways. And to your point on letting them use Eric Gordon as basically the quarterback of that second unit, I mean, to an extent, yes, but I do think there's something to be said for just having him out there in those first 6 minutes of the first and third quarters. That takes a lot of his energy. I think we saw this game when he's really dialed in and he's feeling it when he first enters a game. That's when he's at his springiest. And so I think, if you really use him to optimize those without wasting the minutes elsewhere that maybe he isn't needed, then you can get the best out of Eric Gordon. I also think that maybe that can make him, a bit better at the point of attack on defense, because that's clearly an issue for this team. I think the last couple of games have underscored that. Like, not saying that Kevin Porter Jr. and Jalen Green are plus defenders, but they are not the only problems. Really, there's not any good point of attack defender on this entire team. And that's why sometimes it can be sort of hard to evaluate Alperen Sengun. Clearly, he has his defensive issues, but also the guards on the perimeter are not really stopping dribble penetration. I mentioned earlier, like Daishen Nix, Josh Christopher, not really being rotation caliber players right now. Hopefully Josh can develop into that. Still not giving up on him, midway through his second season. But then Garrison Matthews, he played significant minutes tonight with all the issues, and he was 1 of 5 from 3. When Garrison Matthews, basically a volume 3-point shooter, isn't making his threes at a satisfactory clip, he's not really a rotation caliber player either. So it's just a lot of the same issues. And again, not saying that like optimizing Eric Gordon a certain way is going to fix them. That's way too pie in the sky. But yeah, you might can get an incremental bump here or there. And at the end of the day, that can make a big difference, because in these games, they lost the game by 21 points, but they were right there. What you want is just somehow something to keep you in the game, to give you a chance, so that by the time you that closing group with 7-8 minutes left, whatever it is in the fourth quarter, you have a chance. That's what's so frustrating. We see all these positive signs, and some of it may be that the game naturally, gets a little less sort of helter-skelter in the second half. The Clippers with Kawhi Leonard made it much more of a half-court slugfest, which does not work to the benefit of this particular Rockets team. But honestly, even in the second half, again, they, took a punch and bounced back. They tied the game early in the fourth quarter. What you want is to give them some high-leverage possessions late in the game, to where even if they don't win, at least you feel like, okay, these guys, we're seeing how they fare in high-leverage possessions, and we're not even getting that. And so with that as the backdrop, yeah, it's confounding and it's frustrating that we're not seeing more experiments, that we're not seeing them think outside the box more than they have to this point.
And I do think over these last 3 games or so, in this one specifically, Alperen Sengun, 15 points, 7 of 12 shooting, did nail his only 3-point attempt, and then had 8 boards, 6 dimes, a steal, a block, and 6 turnovers. And that's like, here's the issue, is as much as we clamor for more involvement for Al P, there are going to be games where he gets more involvement, like this one, because of the absence of both Kevin and Jalen, and the offense does run through him quite a bit more, and he's going to have some ugly games. He's going to have some games where it's not going to look great, where he's going to make mistakes, he's going to have some forced turnovers, and it's going to be bad, but the only way he can get better and grow from it and learn from it is to actually have those experiences, right, to get those reps in the first place. And, maybe the next game that he does where he's, high usage and the offense is going through him, it'll look great again, right, to where he doesn't have 6 turnovers. This was a very good defensive LA Clippers team that understood how to swarm the basketball, how to pressure him, how to play passing lanes. There were some passes that he just completely telegraphed that were picked off by Nicholas Batum and Ivica Zubac, and that's the nature of this Clippers team, is they are a good defensive team. They held the Rockets to exactly 100 points, only 10 points scored in that fourth quarter, again, in part because they tried to survive with a lineup out there with any offensive engines, creators, whatever you want to call it, for a stretch of the game, and that did not work out whatsoever. But elsewhere from this one, Ben, and we didn't get a chance to, I wanted to mention this in segment 2 when we were talking about Jabari, but you look at his stat line, 12 points, 5 of 15 shooting, 2 of 6 from downtown. You're like, all right, he's still not hitting shots. But the thing that's really stood out to me over these last, maybe 5 or so games especially is his effectiveness and willingness as a passer. He only had 2 assists in this game, but Jabari, and to your point about comfortability, he does look more comfortable out there. He looks like he's willing to put the ball on the floor and try to make something happen. These little scoop passes, little shovel passes, making reads that you're like, oh, we didn't realize this was in Jabari's bag. And if you're seeing moments like that from him right now as a rookie, only halfway through his rookie season, that is incredibly encouraging, because then you're starting to think, okay, maybe there is more than just a super 3-and-D player there further down the line, right? The moments where he has the dribble pull-ups in transition, where he's creating his own looks, attacking the rim and finishing, those moments where you're like, oh, if this kid can really put together more than what he already has in his wheelhouse, he could be a very, very special talent.
Yeah, I would go a step further than saying just the passing. I mean, sure, we've seen a couple of those, but it's more just the overall creation. And sometimes you see it in the passing, but where it all originates is his increased willingness to put the ball on the floor and make something happen, not just up and down, but side to side as well. That's something that's really impressed me the last few games. He's a lot shiftier than he seemed to be early in the year. Early in the year on his drives, he seemed a bit more stiff. And maybe in hindsight, it was just trying to trust himself at the NBA level, trying to figure out what he can do against this competition. And of course, he's sort of growing into his new body as well. They're doing a lot of work with him as far as strength and conditioning in the weight room, trying to build strength, but of course, not doing it too quickly. All the things we talked about with Jalen Green in the past applied to Jabari Smith as well, even though he's a big. I think the last few games, we're seeing him do more stuff side to side in terms of going off his dribbles, not just trying directly to go to the rim. And sometimes in the past, he's picked up a lot of offensive fouls doing that, but going to the side for, the pull-up J from time to time, or, in many cases, putting a defender out of position by doing that and drawing a second defender, and then he can kick it to somebody. And he's had the vision to complete those passes as well. It's just, he's taking on more playmaking, more creating responsibilities. And I've been really intrigued because they look really smooth. It doesn't look like he's a fish out of water to where his footwork gets, clunky the way it does with a lot of guys that are just trying to do too much. No, it looks really natural. I think the only thing that hasn't come around Friday, it sort of did, is the shooting. And that's the thing I've said before. That's what you should be worried about least. I know it's frustrating right now, but there's a long sample of Jabari Smith as a shooter. There's a lot of people who have looked at his form that agree this guy can shoot the basketball. That's going to come with time. It's the other elements where there were more questions. And in my opinion, those are being answered. So I think, I don't know if it's going to be as crazy as Jalen a year ago, simply because he just doesn't have that type of burst. But I do think there's going to be a point pretty soon in the second half of this season where Jabari goes on a run that really opens eyes, because he's almost there now. We saw it Friday against the Kings with 27 and 8 on 55% shooting. There's going to come a point where when he starts making threes and mid-range shots with the capability that we know he has with his track record going back to college and beyond, he's going to put up some numbers in a hurry, because he's doing all the other things right now. It's just the shot just isn't consistently there. Once that gets there and you combine it with all the other developments in his game, then he's going to start having some 20 and 10, 25 and 12 type games in a hurry that are going to turn heads around the NBA. But for us in Houston, it honestly shouldn't be that much of a surprise. He's almost there now. Once he gets a couple extra shots to fall, then I think you may have something of a Jabari version of what Jalen did in the second half of last season.
Jabari right on the precipice, right on the cusp of greatness for a rookie. But yeah, I do want to give one more player his flowers just before we move on, because the Rockets did take an L. They've taken a lot of L's recently, which means we get to fire up a tankathon simulation. But Tari Eason, whose minutes off the Rockets bench, he continues to be an impactful player. 11 points, 5 of 6 shooting, had 4 rebounds, 2 assists, 3 steals, a block, was very switchy on the defensive end, had moments where he was checking Norm Powell, Kawhi Leonard, just guarding multiple different Clippers. And even though, again, some of those guys did finish with strong nights, just, making guys individually work for a lot of what they were having to get on the defensive end. And I liked that he was converting layups. And that's always nice to see, because there's like a duality with Tari Eason, where you get the good Tari games where he's converting layups and dunks at a high clip. And then you get the bad Tari games where it seems like nothing is going in within 5 feet of the rim. And those are always really, really frustrating. So just wanted to give Tari Eason a quick shout out here before we move on to our tankathon
and by the way,
spin.
And by the way, I thought his plus minus was really misleading. He had one of the bad ones for this game, but I think that largely had to do with the fact that he was out there with the second units disproportionately and with those groupings where, as we said earlier, they just ran out of talent. I think he's the one exception. You look at guys like Daisha Nix and Josh Christopher, I think, and Garrison Matthews as well, their plus minuses are reflective of how they played and just the groupings that were in. The Rockets just ran out of rotation caliber players. But Tari Eason, he played well in those minutes. It just happened to be that those were the guys he was out there with.
Yeah, no, absolutely. He makes things happen when he's on the basketball court. All right,
and his
Ben.
Mom is there to celebrate these next 2 games.
Oh, so. Yeah, there was the huge dunk, and then Mama Eason was all fired up in the crowd. That was a ton of fun from this one. All right, Ben, how are you feeling about this? Rockets have the best lottery odds now with a 10-33 record. What's your prediction for where this spin lands? I'm gonna say 2.
I'm gonna go 3.
You're gonna go 3. All right, here we go. All right, let's see what we got here. We send the lottery, and oh God, ugly. All right. Detroit jumps up 2 spots to number 1. San Antonio jumps up 2 spots to number 2. Charlotte falls 1 spot to number 3, and Houston falls 3 spots all the way down to number 4 in the draft. Yeah, this is a bad one. We've had some good spins here at LOR. This one's a bad one. And then the rest of the lottery order just goes chalk after that. So unfortunate. Rockets get one of whoever's left between Amin or Asar Thompson at that point. But
although one trend in mock drafts, this is a random side note, but that I've liked a lot in recent days. I noticed Jeremy Wu did this last week with Sports Illustrated, but I really think more people should do their mock drafts based on a tankathon spin, because I think some of the flawed discourse, people think that, the odds of bad teams getting these top prospects are way better than they actually are, because throughout the year, they read these mock drafts that are solely based on the standings, whereas the standings are just such a small indicator, especially with the revised lottery odds, where you can be the worst team like the Rockets are right now, and yet your odds of Wemby are only 14%. Your odds of Wemby or Scoot are basically just 27%. There's so much more instability in that lottery than some of the discourse would lead you to believe. And I think a better way to account for that is if people doing mock drafts would, before doing the mock draft, do a tankathon spin and then draft. And I think Wu's mock draft ended up having like Toronto at number 1, something crazy like that. And to me, that would actually make the discourse a bit better, because I just don't think everyone fully, has accepted just how wild the odds actually are now.
No, I agree with that. I think that would be a nice little trend if we can maybe get that rolling. Maybe we'll try and start the push for that, Ben. But you know the drill. Let everyone know where they can track you down at.
Yep. Ben DuBose on Twitter, the Rockets Wire on Twitter, rocketswire.usatoday.com for all your daily news coverage. And then the Logger Line on Twitter, where I strongly encourage you, if you have some time, it took nearly 2 hours, but I just put out an episode a couple of days ago with Paolo evaluating the entire tenure, the good and the bad, of Rafael Stone, nearly 3 seasons in Houston. So yeah, you can find that at the Logger Line, or search for the Logger Line at your podcast distributor of choice. And just make sure you have some time budgeted for that one.
And that's going to do it for another edition of Locked On Rockets. As always, thank you so much for checking out the show. If you haven't done so yet, please consider subscribing wherever you listen to your podcasts. That's Apple, Spotify, Google, the Odyssey app, free and available on all podcast platforms. We're also available on YouTube. Just go to YouTube, search Locked On Rockets. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Tell me your thoughts on how the Houston Rockets played without Jalen Green and Kevin Porter Jr. Is this how they should be playing moving forward? Let me know in the YouTube comments. I do read each and every one of those every single day. But as always, thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for listening. And we look forward to having you back right here at Locked On Rockets, your daily podcast home for everything Houston Rockets basketball.